From 1978 to 1983, at least a dozen young men vanished from the city of London. They fell prey to this sadistic and evil man, who did not let them go even after he took their lives. Many were found stashed around his apartment like sick trophies, and several have still not been identified. The creature performed dissections and other more unspeakable things on the young men's bodies. The horrific crimes were not discovered until the drains became clogged with bits of human meat and bone, drawing the plumbers to call the police. Once the police were in his home, the monster openly showed them the remains that he had kept in his apartment. His crimes and actions led many to compare him to the Milwaukee Cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer, and some of their crimes occurred around the same time. Dennis Nilsen, the kindly killer.
Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, just months after the end of World War II in Fraserburgh, Scotland. His father was a member of the Free Norwegian Forces named Olaf Magnus Moksheim, who had come to Scotland during the war. After 2 years in the country, he was using the name Nilsen and had married a woman named Elizabeth Duthie White. Olaf spent much of his time moving back and forth between Scotland and Norway, and very little time with his wife other than to have 3 children with her. They had never even gotten a home together, and Elizabeth had to camp out at her parents' home. And so the marriage did not last, and the couple divorced in 1948. Dennis spent much of his time with his grandparents. They took their daughter and her 3 children on picnics and trips to the country. He grew particularly close to his grandpa, and the two went on long walks along the shoreline. When his grandfather was away from the family with his work as a fisherman, Dennis was miserable. And on Halloween night of 1951, the 6-year-old would lose his grandfather forever when the 62-year-old passed away at sea from a heart attack. One of the strongest memories from his childhood was seeing the body during the wake as his family mourned the loss. Dennis had already been a quiet boy, but the death made him even more withdrawn. Dennis spent a significant amount of time wandering along the same routes that he had walked with his grandfather. On one of these outings, Dennis nearly drowned, but was rescued by another boy. At home, he began to resent the attention from his mother on his siblings. In 1955, his mother moved with her kids out of her parents' house and remarried. She had 4 more children with her new husband, Andrew Scott. The family settled in Striken, Scotland. Things were a little rough for Dennis as his stepfather was a disciplinarian, and as he got older, he realized that he was interested in boys, not girls. In a bizarre way, to try to explore his feelings, Nilsen realized that the boys he was interested in reminded him of his sister, which led him to touch her inappropriately, and later he did the same to his sleeping older brother. Things got worse in the home after these bizarre acts on his siblings, with his brother suspecting that he was gay and calling him names. At school and with friends, Dennis also felt shame over the fact that his family was poor compared to his peers in the community. Partially due to this, he joined the Army Cadet Forces at age 14, seeing military service as a way to escape the dead-end situation that he felt he was in. After graduating from high school, Nilsen spent a brief period working in a factory, but after only a few weeks he decided it was not for him. In September of 1961, he enlisted for a 9-year term in the Army. The young man excelled during training and described it as the happiest time in his life. Dennis was suddenly traveling and seeing more of the country than he ever had, and even took part in a parade which was attended by the Queen. During his service, Nilsen felt an attraction toward his male colleagues. He feared that it would get out, and so he avoided showering with others to avoid any chance of an unwanted salute among the other men. After 3 years, he began working toward a certification in catering, while stationed in West Germany. To stifle his shyness among his peers, the young private began drinking heavily. In one circumstance, he drank to the point that he passed out while in the company of a German boy. When he woke up and saw his young drinking buddy unconscious, a new fantasy was seated in his mind. The idea of a young, slender man who was completely passive that he could use for whatever he wanted excited him. This fantasy would develop into the heinous acts that he would later commit on both unconscious and dead victims. Once he had completed his catering certification, Nilsen was stationed in what is now Yemen as a cook in the Al Mansoura prison. This location was more dangerous than his previous posts, with several of his colleagues getting killed in ambushes. Nilsen did not totally avoid the violence. He was once kidnapped and beaten by a taxi driver, but he was able to get the upper hand and escape. After his time in Yemen was up, Dennis was sent back to a post in the UK, and later in West Berlin, working as a cook with various regiments. He even spent time cooking for the Queen's Royal Guard before retiring from the military after 11 years in October of 1972. The next 2 months were spent back with his family as he decided on his next move. After an incident where Nilsen's older brother told their mother that he was gay, he moved out and never spoke to his brother again and would rarely interact with his mother. In December of 1972, Dennis made the decision to join the Metropolitan Police and move to London. After training, he began working as a junior constable during the day and visiting the gay bars at night, but he felt that his career and lifestyle were at odds. In August of 1973, his biological father died, leaving each of his children a small amount of money. A few months later, in December, Dennis Nilsen resigned from the police force. For several months, he worked as a security guard as he looked for a long-term job, eventually finding work at a job center, where he helped unskilled laborers find employment. Nilsen would be promoted in 1979, and in 1982, he moved to work at a job center in a neighborhood of London called Kentish Town. By this time, he had also begun committing his horrific crimes. After several unsuccessful relationships, Nilsen began increasingly solitary, with most of his free time spent drinking and listening to music alone in the apartment at 195 Melrose Avenue in the London neighborhood called Cricklewood Park, which is a fantastic name for a neighborhood. By the time that Dennis moved to Kentish Town to work at the job center, he was already a murderer, killing his first victim on December 30th, 1978. The first victim was a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Holmes, who had been denied alcohol at a pub where Nilsen was drinking, and he invited the boy back to his apartment for a drink. After an excessive amount of alcohol, both passed out. In the morning, Nilsen feared that the teenager would leave and he would never see him again, and felt a bizarre need to control him, very similar to Jeffrey Dahmer, who also had the urge to control and possess his victims. In a panic, Nilsen grabbed a necktie and used it to strangle him until he was unconscious, then finished the job by drowning Holmes. He then washed the body in his bathtub and laid with it in his bed. Eventually, he stashed young Stephen under the floorboards of the apartment, where it would remain until August 11, 1979, when Nilsen took it into his backyard garden and burned it. The following men and boys are only the cases which have been proven to have occurred, or that Nilsen made a credible confession for, and there are likely many more victims of this monster. After the murder of Holmes in December of 1978, Nilsen did not kill again until almost exactly a year later in December of 1979. Though in October, he did attempt to strangle a young man from Hong Kong that he met in a bar, but the young man escaped, and unfortunately did not press charges, likely due to him not wanting the gay encounter to become public. But on December 3rd, Dennis met a young Canadian tourist named Kenneth Ockenden. The 23-year-old had been drinking in a West End bar, and when the creature offered to show him the sights of London, Kenneth agreed. The last time that the young man was seen alive was as the pair purchased alcohol before going to Nilsen's home. Once he had gotten Kenneth drunk, the monster crept up behind him while he listened to music and used a wire to strangle him. Horrifically, Nilsen then sat with the body drinking and listening to the same music. The next day, he went out and bought a Polaroid camera that he used to take pictures of Ockenden in various suggestive poses, in another similarity to Jeffrey Dahmer and his treatment of his victims. When he was finally done with the body, he wrapped it in plastic and again stashed it under the floorboards, though he would report taking him out several times to sit with his victim as he drank and watched TV. Kenneth's family reported him missing, which is one of the ways that he differed from most of the other victims, who simply disappeared without anyone noticing, which is an extremely sad aspect of this case. A few months later, on May 17, 1980, Nilsen was once again on the prowl. He came across a 16-year-old hitchhiker named Martin Duffy. He had been sleeping on the streets of London, and so when the creature offered him a bed and meal, Duffy eagerly agreed. As the young man slept, Nilsen crept up and tightened a rope around his neck as he knelt on his chest. Once he was unconscious, Dennis drowned Duffy in his kitchen sink. Nilsen seemed to enjoy this body more than others, and he spent 2 days with it before putting it under the floorboards when he noticed that it had started to rot. Once again, this need to control his victims even after their death is very similar to the disgusting crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer. After killing for the third time, Dennis was able to hold back for several months, but was unable to restrain himself for long, and once the dam broke, the pace accelerated. On August 20th, 1980, Dennis met a 26-year-old named William Sutherland. The young man worked occasionally as an escort, and the creature came across him in a pub in Piccadilly Circus. In this case, Nilsen did not recall the details of the crime, just that when they got to his apartment, he strangled him. The next several young men and boys who lost their life to Nilsen were never identified, but he would later confess to a murder every month until well into 1981. The victim killed in September was later described by the monster as an Irish laborer in his late 20s that he had met in a pub called the Cricklewood Arms. The October victim was described as a slim male prostitute in his mid-20s who was either Mexican or Filipino. Nilsen met him in the Salisbury Arms. In November, he took the life of a homeless young man that he had met sleeping in a doorway along Charing Cross Road. Nilsen would remark how the youth's life seemed to be full of suffering and how easy it had been for him to take it. The December victim was what Dennis referred to as a long-haired hippie in his late 20s. Nilsen met him on the West End as the bars closed down for the night. He kept him under the floorboards, then cut the body into 3 pieces for easier storage, until eventually burning it a year later. On January 4, 1981, Nilsen met an 18-year-old he described as a blue-eyed Scot. The creature's recollection of this victim is better than some of the others, and he could recall his exact outfit. He met the boy at the Golden Lion pub in the Soho district of London. Dennis invited him home, then challenged him to a drinking contest. Once the young man was incapacitated, Nilsen did his evil work. Nilsen did not recall much about the life he took in February, other than that he was in his early 20s and from Belfast. He took him home from the West End pubs and strangled him with a necktie before stashing him under the floorboards. There was a brief pause, but Nilsen would claim, then retract, that he had killed a 20-year-old skinhead in April. He would say how he had hung the body up for a day before putting it under the floorboards. After the murder spree that he had just gone on, Dennis was satisfied for a while, and he did not strike again until September 18, 1981. Nilsen met a 23-year-old named Malcolm Barlow. The young man was an epileptic who had spent much of his childhood in foster care. Barlow had suffered a seizure, and Nilsen had found him and taken him to the hospital. The young man had gone to Nilsen's apartment to thank him, and for his trouble was killed. The creature had to put him in the cupboard as there was no more space under the floorboards. Barlow would be the last victim killed at the Melrose Avenue apartment. A month after Barlow, in March, Nilsen moved to a new apartment at 23 Cranley Gardens in the Muswell Hill neighborhood. That same month that he moved in to the new spot, he was on the search for a victim. Dennis came across a 23-year-old named John Howlett drinking at a nearby pub. This was another victim that Nilsen would drown after strangling him unconscious. He then cut the body into pieces and flushed what he could down the toilet and put the rest out with his trash. In September of 1982, the monster invited a 27-year-old tourist named Graham Allen back to his apartment. This would be one of the victims whose remains were found clogging the sewage system of the Cranley Garden apartments. He was later identified using dental records, but strangely, Nilsen was not charged with this murder. The final victim was a 20-year-old addict named Stephen Sinclair, who Nilsen came across on Oxford Street on January 26, 1983. He bought the young man a hamburger, then took him back to his apartment. Sinclair would be one of the victims whose murder Nilsen would be charged with. A large amount of human remains had been disposed of by flushing them down the toilet at this point. This idiotic method of disposal would be the creature's downfall, as on February 8th, Nilsen and other residents complained of clogged drains in the apartment building. A plumber named Michael Catron arrived to investigate the blockage and soon discovered a pile of flesh and bones in the drainage pipes, and contacted his supervisor, Gary Wheeler. When the residents were told about the substance found in the pipes, Nilsen remarked that it looked like someone had been flushing chicken bones. The next day, when the plumbers returned, they found that most of the meat and bones had been cleared out of the pipes, but they did find a few bones that appeared to have come from a human hand and contacted police. The remains were brought to a mortuary where they were confirmed to have come from a person. Upon investigating the source of the blockage, the police determined that it had started in the top-floor apartment, so they waited outside for the resident to return. When Dennis got home, he let the 3 officers into his apartment, and they all noticed the same smell that had gotten Gacy caught. The smell of rotting flesh permeated the apartment. The police informed Nilsen that the pipes had been blocked with human remains, and the creature feigned surprise. But when police told him to stop lying and show them the rest of the body, he immediately confessed that the rest was in plastic bags in his wardrobe. Upon inspection, the investigators found that the wardrobe was where some of the smell had been coming from. When they asked Dennis if there were any more bodies in the apartment, the killer replied, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest. Not here, at the police station." On the drive from his apartment to the police station, one of the officers asked how many people they would find in his apartment, and the creature told them that it was between 15 and 16 and had started in 1978. The initial inspection of the home turned up parts from at least 2 separate people, and when they interrogated Nilsen, he pointed them to a third that was readily accessible. As they questioned the killer, he changed the estimate from between 15 to 16 to between 12 and 13, and in the apartment, more bags were being found containing additional body parts. As he confessed to the murders, Nilsen also told the investigators that some had occurred in his old apartment on Melrose Avenue. One of the bodies, that of Stephen Sinclair, was able to be quickly identified due to his fingerprints being on record. To keep Nilsen locked up, police charged him with this crime immediately. Over the next few days, he would describe each murder in detail, and the various methods that he had used to try to keep the parts he wanted to keep from going bad. The creature had kept most of the Melrose Avenue bodies for weeks if not longer, and those at Cranley Gardens for much shorter periods of time. When asked why he had committed such horrific crimes, Dennis explained that he simply could not stop, as it was his one source of happiness in life, which is absolutely terrifying. While he was open with police in the interrogation room, Nilsen was more combative in jail. At one point, he refused to wear the prison uniform until he was found guilty. When guards came by his cell, he flung the contents of his toilet at them, resulting in a solitary confinement stay. Dennis Nilsen was officially charged with 6 murders total on May 26, 1983. In the months leading up to the trial, the monster fired and rehired his court-appointed lawyer several times, eventually switching to a different lawyer shortly before he was to appear in court, with the defense opting to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. The trial began on October 24, 1983. The claim of insanity did not hold up against the 15 sets of remains that had been found between his 2 apartments, nor the fact that the dozen that police had found at the Melrose Avenue address were nothing more than charred remains. Going to such lengths to conceal his crimes made it clear that Nilsen was well aware that what he was doing was wrong. Men who had been attacked by the creature but had been able to escape testified about their experience, and police described what they had found at both apartments, and everything that Nilsen had confessed to doing, horrifying the jurors. This was followed by psychiatrists working for the defense, but neither had any compelling diagnosis to mitigate the horrors that had been brought before the court. The prosecution's psychiatrist said that while Nilsen was abnormal, he was not diminished to the point that he should not be held responsible. On November 4th of 1983, Dennis Nilsen was found guilty of 6 murders and 1 attempted murder. Justice Croom Johnson sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum recommendation of 25 years. As horrible as the prospect is of someone who's committed such heinous crimes being released into the public is, thankfully it would never come to pass. Nilsen was sent to HMP Wormwood Scrubs, where he tried to appeal his conviction. Nilsen was not popular in prison and was regularly targeted by other inmates, including one instance where he was slashed so badly with a razor that he required nearly 100 stitches on his face. After the razor attack, Nilsen was moved around to 3 different prisons, eventually ending up at HMP Full Sutton, a prison for vulnerable inmates. In December of 1994, he was at HMP Whitemore when his sentence was replaced with a whole life tariff, meaning that he would never get out of prison. In 2003, he was back at Full Sutton, where he would remain until 2018. In his time behind bars, Nilsen would paint, exchange letters with various people, and translate books into Braille for the blind. On May 10, 2018, the killer was taken to York Hospital with severe stomach pains. The doctors examined him and found a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, which is when the largest artery in the body swells out and in this case bursts. Nilsen went into surgery and the aorta was repaired, but a blood clot as a result of the surgery led to Nilsen's death on May 12, 2018. His body was cremated and his service had only 5 attendees, 3 of which were prison staff, and 1 was a person that he had only exchanged letters with. A quiet end to a horrific life of violence. With so many similarities in their motivations and crimes, it is easy why some refer to Dennis Nilsen as the UK Jeffrey Dahmer.